thank you all for joining us. Nice crowd today. It's good. Today we are joined by Ben Brown from University of Colorado. He's been there since the fall of 2014. He's one of the new faculty members there. Ben also received his PhD at the University of Colorado with Yuri in the audience here today. Spent 4 years at University of Madison and 1 year in California before coming to CU Boulder. And today Ben's going to talk to us about deep solar convection. Ben.
All right, thanks, Alfred. Yeah, you could say that I've been at the University of Colorado since fall of 2003, as many of you know. I wanted to talk to you about convection deep in the sun today, and I wanted to I want to give you an update of kind of where things are from the theory and computation side, show you some observational questions that are really perplexing us theorists, implore people who are interested, especially in helioseismic observations, to help, and to have a discussion around all of this. So please ask lots of questions as we go. Maybe after the first couple of cartoons, which you're quite familiar with. So here's our sun. We're going to be talking about the deep convection zone of the sun, the parts of the sun that are well below the photosphere. The motions down there are very responsible for both the large-scale differential rotation we observe, and likely also for the dynamo properties of the sun, especially the amplification of the poloidal field. So the sun, the convection zone is the outer 30%. That's a highly stratified domain. It spans about 14 density scale heights from the bottom to the optical photosphere. In that region, we see, with helioseismology, a strong differential rotation that extends from the equator to the poles. The equator goes fast, the poles go slow. The differential rotation propagates throughout the entire convection zone and then stops at the tachocline at the bottom. We're going to talk today about convection in this bulk region and some properties of it, and also its coupling to this tachocline, and whether the tachocline is dynamically coupled to the convection zone, and what role it might play in the dynamo, which I think is a very interesting question. For a lot of this, we're going to be talking about numerical simulations, and as a reminder, numerical simulations can only be an approximation of the sun because the sun is a very turbulent object. We like Reynolds numbers. It's got a Reynolds number of about 10 to the 15. The fanciest things I'm going to show you today are Reynolds numbers of 10 to the 4, and that's challenging in and of itself. So there's a mere 11 orders of magnitude between the real sun and us in one parameter of measurement.
But you agree in the sign.
We agree in the sun. One other interesting thing is we're going to talk a bit about rotational constraint in the interior of the sun. And I at least have grown up with the belief that the sun is a Rossby #1 object. So the deep cells of convection take maybe about a month to overturn for the convection zone spanning things. The sun rotates in a month, and so it should be fairly weakly constrained. And there may actually be some new evidence that it's actually quite a bit lower than that. And this is a kind of unifying topic in this talk. Many things about the sun that we thought we had sorted out dynamically in the deep interior, the answers often tend, it looks like now, to be much smaller in amplitude for the convective motions, which has some pretty profound consequences. So, when we have some idea of how the dynamo in the sun operates, which really motivates a lot of this work, we see some roles happening in the convection zone. Here's a cartoon view of the convection zone. Here's a vastly expanded view of the tachocline. The stable radiative zone that's 2/3 of the sun is below that. And to remind you, of course, the magnetism that so many of us study and the cycles of it have their origin in this convection zone. This is a cartoon by Nick Brummel talking about how local processes in the convection zone build field, which then gets pumped down into the tachocline, where it's smoothly stretched out by the differential rotation and becomes buoyantly unstable to emerge as spots of the photosphere. This is sort of our canonical view of how the solar dynamo operates, right? With this large shear engine of differential rotation helping build things. Thanks for that figure, by the way, Mike. You sent that to me about 5 years ago. It's been fantastically useful.
I should sign my figures like
you should. Mike Thompson's responsible for this helioseismic figure up here. It's quite lovely. All right, and so we often talk about a solar dynamo that, at least conceptually, is separated with some sort of alpha effect some turbulent creation of magnetic field happening up in the convection zone, and an omega effect, the coupling of shear to magnetism to build large-scale fields. And this is kind of an extended version of Parker's interface dynamo, and we often think about these things being fairly segregated, and we have thought that the Tachocline was very important to the solar dynamo. I'm phrasing it that way because we did a fair bit of work in the last decade that showed that, surprisingly, we could get organized large-scale fields even without Tachoclines. I'm going to remind you of that very briefly. So this is work that I did with Yuri and a large team of others, including Mark Misch in the audience here, using the ASH code. We did global scale simulations of dynamo action in the interior of stars like the sun. We chose to rotate them more rapidly. So this was a star rotating 5 times the sun, solar mass, solar luminosity. And when we did this, we found surprising things. This is a full volume rendering of the magnetism in one of these solutions. It's a sphere. The sphere has sacrificed the front of itself, just like this squash up here was sacrificed to a cleaver so that we can peer into the sphere and see the interior. So the outer surface is here, the inner surface is here. This is 30% of the sphere, like the solar convection zone. This doesn't span all the way up to the photosphere. We can't do that in global scale simulations, but it captures out to about 95% or so of the solar radius. So, we're stopping at about 30 or 15 megameters down below the surface, at least so we think to ourselves. And you see the lines here are tracing the large-scale vector magnetic field, and the colors are giving the polarity of the toroidal field, which is the same as the sunspots. And the thing that charmed us so much was that all of the polarity in the northern hemisphere is organized in one big bundled structure that's red. All the polarity in the southern hemisphere is one big bundled structure that's blue. We went and named these poetically wreaths of magnetism, and they have some features a bit like sunspot regions, maybe, at least in the eyes of optimistic numerical theorists. Here's the same view where we've cut the poles off and tilted a little more so you can see that this structure really is connected all the way around. And this is living in the convection zone itself. This simulation actually has no Tachocline. There's just a polished bottom. And so there's no stable layer. There's no storage region in the way that we sort of thought of it. And yet we managed to achieve these sorts of results. In addition to spatial organization, there's also temporal organization. So here is this exact same simulation in 2 identical views at an early time and a later time. And the thing that has changed between the 2 views is the structure in the northern hemisphere has become blue, the structure in the southern hemisphere has become red, and there's been actually a reversal of the global scale polarity. True for the poloidal field as well. It does all sorts of lovely things. The poloidal field changes when the toroidal is at peak. It's got quadrature phase. It's got things that seem sort of salient for a solar like Dynamo. Here, operating entirely in the convection zone. So yeah, go ahead, Derek.
Would you expect this to be more active than the sun because it's a faster rotator, so more like a young sun?
In a real star, we would expect this to be more active than the sun. Probably almost an order of magnitude more active for this rotation rate, but I'd have to think about that a little bit. No, we kind of made a business and an industry of studying, or I made a business and industry of studying some of these Dynamo solutions in a rotation parameter space, and Nick Nelson did a huge amount of work for this, and we found all sorts of things. We found some, so these are time latitude plots of the organized azimuthally averaged magnetic field in the middle of the convection zone for a few of these solutions, all shown the same way. So the southern pole is here, the northern pole is here, the equator is here. The colors have the same sense. They're the toroidal field polarity. In the upper left, we see some solutions where you get big structures that live sort of for as long as we were willing to integrate for, so they seem to persist. We got some, as we go down here, still the same rotation rate, but some other parameters that are different that have sort of simple, organized flips of polarity, at least for these 2 cycles. And then we get some here that flip more frequently and do some other stuff in between. We've seen a variety of cycle rates in these things. The The 5 solar one that's in the lower right-hand corner, which is the one we were seeing in the volume renderings a moment ago, has a time scale of about 1,500 days in the sort of solution.
But those polarity flips are then accompanied by really strong fields at very high latitude.
That's right, Michael. When these flips happen, there's a strong propagation of field up to the polar regions. And in fact, for this solution, there's no real equatorial propagation of the magnetic structure at all. Though Kyle Augustin got a solution that did have that I'll show you in just a moment. And we found these things sort of essentially everywhere in our parameter spaces we studied. Sorry, I've overshot myself here slightly. So here's a blown out parameter space. We were just looking at these solutions here. This parameter space is set up so the x-axis is the rotation rate of the star. The sun is where this big blue valley is, that I'll explain in a moment. Here's extremely rapidly rotating things. Here's 5 solar things. For kind of a reminder, the very fastest solar type stars spin maybe 100 times faster than the sun at birth. They spin down very quickly from their magnetized winds. 10 times the solar rotation rate is where you are within a gigayear or less, and then you slowly spin down to the solar rotation rate of 5 gigayears. And so we kind of thought we were probing some of this parameter space. We were looking at the question of activity. Could we get something at a rotation activity correlation? Yeah.
How do you define failed dynamo?
Oh, yes. So there's this big blue valley where we couldn't get sustained dynamo solutions for the way that we were doing these particular simulations. So so the vertical axis here is the diffusivity of the simulation. It's how easy it is for the magnetic fields to diffuse. The top of the screen is easy to simulate. The bottom of the screen is very hard to simulate. These are values of 10 to the 12. The value in the sun is somewhere around 1,000, I think, for the magnetic diffusivity. And if it's not 1,000, then it's 1. Right? So it's about 12 orders of magnitude down in this diffusivity space. So the direction you want to be going is going down. This is the Brune, Misch, and Toomre paper from 2004, which was the state of the art then, and was still relatively challenging to be computing in sort of the early to mid 2000s, and that kind of sets the bottom threshold of where we could do dynamo solutions. So you can see at the solar rate, it was quite hard to get these kinds of dynamos. And the reason for that is that in the simulations we've been doing at the solar rate, our solar simulations are very near a Rossby number of 1. Now the Rossby number is a fluid parameter that measures how strongly the rotation influences the motions. When you're at rapid rotation, the Rossby number is quite small, and the rotation can make the motions really line up and organize. So it's much easier to get organized magnetic field amplification. When you're at a Rossby number of 1, the rotational constraint is much weaker, and so the flows look much more like what we see in something like supergranulation or things like that at the surface of the sun, where they don't know the rotation as well. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. Supergranulation is at even far higher Rossby number, but you lose some of the large-scale organization, and you lose some of the ability to easily run a global-scale dynamo. Also, you not only lose the alignment of the convection, but in this part of the parameter space, the differential rotation that's built, again, because of that rotational constraint, is really whopping strong. And lots of differential rotation means lots of shear to stretch fields with. And that differential rotation engine is a key part of these kinds of global scale convection zone dynamos. So as you go to the sun, you lose some of the convective alignment, you also lose some of the differential rotation amplitude, sort of everything's working against you. Things over here come back up again because you've actually changed the solution in a fundamental way that I'll show you in a moment. You've gotten what we call an anti-solar system where the equator is retrograde and the poles are prograde. This is work that I did a fair bit of, but there's been a huge amount of other work in this. Gazzaro and Racine from Charbonneau's group did a huge amount of very important early work, also finding, sort of coincident with us, that you could get global scale organization and cycles for the first time in these global dynamos. So this stuff really came out in about 2010 when we started achieving global scale solutions that had cycles and interesting properties. Petri Kaplaya, of course, and Thomas Gastin and that group out of Germany. And Nick Nelson did an entire thesis extending and really exploring these things and finding buoyant structures and all sorts of really interesting stuff. So there's been a huge amount of progress in this, and what do you want? So if you even want equatorial propagation, you can find solutions that do all of this and propagate towards the equator. So here's some work by Kyle Augustin. So now you see these polarity reversals happening, only now the magnetic fields maybe do propagate towards the equator in some unambiguous way. There is still a strong polar branch happening as well, each time, right? And so there are a couple things about this. One, none of these have tachoclines, yet they still have spatial and temporal organization. This raises deep questions about what does the tachocline actually do, if we've been ascribing that as sort of a role in the solar dynamo. And another is that everything I've been showing you here is at somewhat more rapid rotation than the sun. And that's because these sorts of things happen fairly easily at low Rossby number, but are very challenging at Rossby number of 1. Lastly, I would argue that a fair bit about the periods of the dynamo cycles and why that comes about is still pretty unclear to us.
Ben?
Yeah.
Question, these are sort of 30% convective zones on the
That's
top.
right.
So if you don't have a tachocline, what does the differential rotation do as you go toward the core?
It can't. So it stops at that boundary. So here it'd be like the tachocline is the hardest imaginable wall in the universe. And a slippery wall, so the differential rotation comes right down to that, but there's no way to communicate, there's no way to know anything about the interior from these solutions, because there's no coupling. And we learned some things from this. We've learned a lot about these wreath-building dynamos and convection zone dynamos in general in the last decade. So our sort of broad takeaway points are we learned that differential rotation in these things is the engine that builds a toroidal field. The poloidal field comes about from turbulent correlations and really is a process we still don't understand despite achieving a large number of these solutions. A real surprise for us was that both the organization and cyclic reversals can happen all within a convection zone alone without a tachocline. That was a surprise, something we had prejudices against from solar dynamo theory when we came into this. And we find these, and we find them mostly at lowest Rossby number. Now, we also found a very perplexing problem. This is the one I mentioned a moment ago about anti-solar differential rotation. So, as now many people have found, if you naively take a solution that is functional at the solar rotation rate, solar luminosity, solar mass, it's produced you something like a nice solar-like differential rotation, and you try and make it more turbulent in the ways that we thought would get us closer to the sun, we found solutions that did something sort of beautiful and pathological. So here's one. This is the convective field from one of these solutions. And normally the differential rotation would be sweeping this way, and the poles would be going this way. But here it's flipped itself. So the arrows show the direction of the large-scale flow, and here's a azimuthally averaged version of large-scale flow. And for a reminder, the solar one in the same kind of color table is shown down in the corner. So we've gotten a thing that's order 1 different. And this is easily achievable at the solar rotation rate and luminosity.
I may be the only one in the room this naive, but
Yeah.
Why is the sun backwards compared to what you expect from naive Coriolis force analysis?
Which is more, I think, like this.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. I don't know. Bark?
Bananas. Meaning we're all bananas.
Yeah.
Now, banana cells, these aligned structures tend to move angular momentum toward the equator. The north-south alignment that you see near the equator. That's...
So forgive me for being an idiot. But I think you just told me that the answer is that the sun is backwards. How do they move the momentum? What's going on?
Well, no. These banana cells, these north-south aligned structures. If you think of the Coriolis force, think of the horizontal convergence of flow that flows into these things. Coriolis forces diverts retrograde flow toward the north, prograde flow toward the equator.
Mm-hmm.
So that gives you a Reynolds stress which moves angular momentum toward the equator.
Okay.
So all convective dynamo or convection simulations that have a fast equator slope pole have these rotationally aligned structures.
Thank you.
But sometimes
Sometimes they're not enough, right?
they're not enough.
So this is still rotationally aligned, but the sort of simple Coriolis argument worked. And so what happened here, what went wrong, and what we have found, so I know at the bottom this is an extremely robust result, and it's been found in a lot of other codes at this point too. So up in this corner, this is more diffusive for this particular atmosphere structure, and so easier to run. Down here is higher resolution, more expensive, less diffusive, more turbulent, and the little snapshots give you some ideas of the differential rotation. Here's fast equators, slow poles, and then as you kind of come down here, everything goes wrong. And this hit us in about 2009, right after we had done the very successful Case F paper in 2008 by Mark and Yuri and others, and we sort of stepped off this cliff. Whereas we moved towards the solar rate, we found that the flows fell apart. Now what's happening here? What's happening here is that the way we're doing our solutions, as we march our way down in a more turbulent way towards the sun, we've actually continuously increased the amplitudes of the convection within the simulation. And this is a fundamental problem, the amplitudes of the convective motion. So the simulations that we were doing here in sort of the early to mid-2000s have too high of an amplitude of convection. This is something we've really been grappling with really just in the last 2 years. Nick Featherstone and Brad Hinman have done a huge amount of work on this. And I'm going to show a very small bit of it right now. And one of the things that they've been finding is that to get solutions that look like the sun, you really should be at low Rossby number. And in fact, from a very lovely recent letter, they turn around and argue from this that the sun might be at very, very low Rossby number compared to what we thought. We have very few direct observational constraints on the amplitudes of the motions deep in the sun. I'll show you what we do have in a couple of slides. But this is a huge problem for making progress on global scale simulations, I think. So these are some very recent simulations by Nick Featherstone with the Rayleigh code, which is sort of a spiritual successor of the Ash code, which some of us in this room were involved in. It's a global scale stratified system. And Nick's been doing explorations of fundamental properties of convection in these things. And this is in some senses the really groundbreaking part of this. Nick and Brad have been peeling back some of the complexity to ask fundamental questions about how does rotating convection work and what does that tell us about what we see in the sun, which helps us then know how to try and actually correctly build a Dynamo model that captures these things. So here's some power spectra that came out of some of these things. They're at some different Rossby numbers. And there's some systematic behavior with the peaks of the power spectra as the Rossby number is decreased. And Nick and Brad noticed that you could actually locate this peak, and this peak had some well-defined behavior in terms of the Rossby number. That's shown over here. And the blue things all have anti-solar differential rotation. Is that right, Brad? And then the red things have all solar-like differential rotation, and you get kind of two classes of behavior of where this peak would be. And they then turn that into a lovely cartoon argument about what we actually see on the sun and what we expect to see. So if the sun was a high Rossby number object that had convective cells that span the entire convection zone and didn't know about rotation, they weren't rotationally constrained, what we would expect to see, so the surface convection of, say, supergranulation is illustrated in red. The blue illustrates the giant cells of convection. And as those of us who do stratified turbulence and other things, the larger the mode, the larger the cell, the more velocity amplitude it has, the more power it has. And so we should see this little tiny red peak, which is the supergranules at the surface, and we should see this absolutely massive blue peak pounding through the supergranules at several hundred meters a second to kilometer a second kind of flows. The giant cells should be really unambiguous, and that's not seen. And so something's going on. So Nick and Brad propose that if they look at their very rotationally constrained flows and how those spectra evolve for things that are much more columnar in structure, that they may actually have, we may actually, in some senses, see the places where the giant cells should be. It's just that they have shifted to higher and higher spherical harmonic degree wave number, and they may have a spherical harmonic degree wave number comparable to the supergranulation, say of 100 or so, 80 to 100. And then they turn that around to infer the Rossby number of the sun, which rather than being 1, they find to be 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 1. So the sun looks much more like something that we otherwise would call a 10 times solar object based on our early simulation work. So this is a profound question. What is the Rossby number of the sun? What are the amplitudes of the flow in the deep interior? I'm going to show you another spot this problem is really cropping up in. So this is some work by Jesse Lord with Mark Rass, both in a paper in 2014 and his thesis. So Jesse was doing a lot of work with the Miriam code, with Matthias and others. He was trying to understand what sets the scale of supergranulation. And in the process of this work, they noticed that these fantastic radiative hydrodynamic simulations that do the best job of capturing the photosphere and really do a great job of doing that. So that's this black line, that's its power spectrum. They noticed as they made these things deeper and deeper and deeper, the power spectrum just went up and up and up. And the supergranules are here, and there's no clear peak from them. And surprisingly, Jesse was able to normalize these in a way so they agree not only with Miriam, but with Bob Stein's stagger code, or Aki Nordland, or whoever is the current inheritor of the stagger code results. And they even actually match onto these blue and orange lines, which are the deep ash simulations. So the surface stuff, the deep stuff, whether it's radiative, whether it's magnetohydrodynamic, whatever, it all agrees. And it all goes from here, and it goes up and up and up and up and up in power spectrum. These are flows of over 1 kilometer a second up here, right, for the large flows. At the same time as all this, Shravan Hanasoje came out with an upper limit constraint from time-distance helioseismology saying the amplitudes that he thought he was able to put a bound on in the deep interior are all the way down there. Right? So we have this huge disagreement initially. Big problem. Both the local models disagree with Shravan and the global models. Then it got even worse. Then Ben Greer did some really phenomenal work with Yuri, with Brad, with Nick Featherstone. Really beautiful work on ring diagram analysis, totally different technique. Thinks he's actually detected the flows, not just set an upper bound, but actually detected them. The amplitudes are given by these error bars. In the previous plot, we were in a power spectrum, so velocity squared. Now we're in a velocity space, so we're at the square root of the previous spectrum. And Ben found these, the red lines here give his measurements. The ash simulations are up there, global scale things, and they're closer to each other in agreement. The disagreement between the two is still dynamically important. Factors of 2 matter in the kind of parameter space the sun is in for the amplitudes. So that story doesn't totally change. But what's really interesting is the 2 best helioseismic observations of motions in the deep interior of the sun disagree with each other at 2 orders of magnitude. 2 orders of magnitude, right? And both teams are really competent, right? And there's a lot of discussion and disagreement about noise models in here versus the way these detections were done, and were the noise models just enough to remove all of the flows that should have otherwise been there. This is a huge, outstanding disagreement, and it really needs a lot of attention. There's way too much room for theorists here right now. Any theory will agree with this right now because of this amount of disagreement. So there really needs to be some investment in these modern helioseismic techniques for measurements. And these are some of Ben Greer's measurements of the actual flows, 1/4 of a megameter down and 10 megameters down. And what's interesting to me is that, so Ben's measuring actual flows pretty far down, and we still don't see any giant spreading centers of convection. We still don't see the giant cells down there. So even with the amplitudes maybe being more in agreement, the flow patterns are still not something that screams out, this is a convective cell to me. So here, like at 10 megameters down, we have a lot of what Yuri and Deborah and others have called solar subsurface weather, organized meandering flows, but no clear overturn or those sorts of things that maybe we might expect. So this is interesting. Where are these giant cells of convection?
So forgive me again for just being a loudmouth here. I see a lot of places in there where the divergence is positive.
So you see a lot over here where the divergence is positive, right? Here we're still in the root of the supergranules, right? You're still probably basically seeing that kind of structure. Here,
Well, for example, look at minus 12 by 7. You've got a sort of supergranular sized expansion there. Over on the left.
excuse me, minus 12. You're
Minus
giving
7.
me, you're giving x then y.
Yeah.
So this area here.
Yeah, see there's a spot there and you can see things diverging from it. And there's lots of places like that all over the board. Are those noise or are those real?
They're actually highly correlated with the supergranulation signal at the surface.
Really?
Take a low pass filter of the surface and you sort of see similar patterns at deeper layers.
Okay.
But you have to put a time lag in.
It's in millimeters, it's not really that deep.
But they're not giant
No.
seals.
No, and we really need to have constraint on the deep motions. I think we really need these kinds of measurements down at about 30 megameters, preferably. 10 still pretty surface overall from the view of someone who's deep in the interior. Ben Greer did some other really amazing work in this, right? He managed to actually measure time correlations between surface layers and deep layers, and he thinks detect things moving down and some other things like that, put some bounds on the vertical flows. Ben did amazing work in this. This work really needs to be extended. This initial work is very hard. This is hard to do computationally. This is a sort of million CPU hour observation, roughly, so comparable to our big simulations. But that's tractable. And this was initially done over a small data set. There's some students now with Brad and Yuri who are trying to do this over larger data sets, but we really need some systematic attack at these problems. Right? We have some of the tools for doing it. They need to be deployed to tell us more about this at depth. Our discrepancies are not just in the helioseismic constraints, they're also present in things like the, if you do correlation tracking on simulations and HMI data. So this is work by Jesse Lord, and this is just to say that, look, there's at least 2 observational ways of seeing that things are off a bit. So the red line, again, is a MIRAM simulation where Jesse has local correlation track the flows to try and figure out what the horizontal flows are like. And then the black line here is the same thing done with HMI, and it's good mostly over here, I've been told, at the larger scales. And above the supergranular scale, there's a huge discrepancy in the amount of horizontal flows in the MIRAM simulations that Jesse was doing compared to the HMI data. Again, saying that the simulated velocities tend to be too large in amplitude compared to the actual observed velocities. So this is for anyone who wants an observation other than helioseismology to show there's some real discrepancy in our understanding of the global scale flows. So what's our summary on some of this? So there are big discrepancies between the observational constraints and the best simulations of deep solar convection to date, at least as we understand them. There's a lot of progress being made on this from the global side, especially in the last 2 years, almost entirely, I think, by Nick Featherstone, who's done really beautiful fundamental work. Many of you know him from his time here as a postdoc. He's currently at CU in the Applied Math department. And it's hinting that we have a real fundamental lack of understanding about how heat is transported, much less angular momentum, magnetic fields, etc., under solar conditions by stratified convection. There are a number of competing theories about how to actually suppress the giant cells. One is entropy rain, which essentially is that we're doing the transport on very small scales that survive all the way across the convection zone. One is magnetic effects. Hideyuki Hota and Matthias did a lot of work on that in the global, what's the name of that code, Matthias?
Amateras, or the reduced speed of sound technique.
Yeah.
One of those.
Yeah, that set of modeling. They found magnetic effects could suppress things a fair bit. Rotational effects may do it. There also may be shielding by the shear of the near surface shear layer. I'll show you a tiny bit about that at the end of today. And really one of the most important takeaways is that the discrepancies between the best current observations are currently unreconciled. There's a lot of work on that. It really, in my mind, this huge observational disagreement is impeding progress because too many theories can agree with one set or the other.
But that basically means that they are measuring two different things.
Yes.
And they
Probably.
don't know. So at least one group doesn't know what they're measuring.
Might be.
Or both.
Or both. Yeah. Yeah. And so this is partly to implore, I feel like I'm very sad that here in the US, I know of one grad student who is working on this kind of problem right now. We need some reinvestments in helioseismology because we really have some new tools and data sets we can work with because we have computation that we can deploy on this at a scale that was unimaginable a decade ago. All right, so I don't know how we do that, but we need to rebuild some of our solar observations, at least at the student level, where Yuri is, to my knowledge, training the only one in the US, Yuri and Brad. Do we know of any other programs there's Northern Arizona, right? Does Jakob have a student too?
Well,
I think.
There's the University of New Mexico. There's
Yeah.
a couple places.
Yeah. So it's not like it was a decade ago when there were quite a few more. Shravan and his cohort. So we're gonna have a little change of pace now. I'm going to show you some work that we're doing to try and tackle the fundamentals of solar convection from local scale simulations. And the idea of these is to isolate the physics of particular solar processes in isolation so we can try and understand them and do the global scale simulations in the same spot, because the global scale simulations are very challenging. And there's some questions we can ask in the local scale ones. And I want to ask two questions. The first one's about convective heat transport, which is basically how does stratified convection transport heat, and is that similar to or different from our understanding of laboratory convection? The second has to do with the Tachocline. So we'll start with the convective heat transport. So laboratory convection of like a pot of water, usually a 1 meter tall column of water or so that's heated at the bottom and cooled at the top, is called Rayleigh-Benard convection. It's incompressible convection. We have a deep literature of this, both simulation-wise and laboratory-wise. It's very easy to do incompressible fluid experiments in a laboratory. Easy. And for that kind of flow, so here's a 2D simulation of that kind of flow. We know that there's a well-expected scaling of the heat transport measured by what's known as the Nusselt number, capital NU, with the driving parameter of the problem, which is the Rayleigh number. For this problem, that is essentially the only parameter that controls the amount of driving. And it shows this very clean 2/7 power law. So you can derive this from certain arguments. Here's a plot of it for 2D simulations done by Johnston and Doring. And they go from, so you started out, nothing happens till you hit a critical Rayleigh number, happens to be around 1,000 or so. At that point, the convection starts. It starts carrying heat more and more efficiently, and it follows this 2/7 scaling law. Now, this Nusselt number is a measurement of how much heat is carried by the flow compared to by conduction. So in the most turbulent of these, the flow is carrying about 100 times more heat than conduction alone would be. Typical lab experiments, these get up to about 10 to the 10. Typical lab experiments are maybe Rayleigh number 10 to the 15. They measure much the same kind of thing. Here's what this kind of flow looks like. This is some work done by Taylor Quist, an undergrad at CU working with us. This is at a Rayleigh number of 10 to the 8, so kind of partway through this thing. This is the temperature field, which measures the buoyancy. This is the entropy, which measures the swirliness. Red things want to go up, and blue things want to go down. And a hallmark of Rayleigh-Benard convection is that it's up-down symmetric. The upflows are the same size and the same amplitude as the downflows coming down. This one's a little turbulent, so it's more challenging to see that, but especially at low Rayleigh number, they're indistinguishable from each other. And if I flipped the picture upside down and changed colors, you wouldn't be able to tell that I had done that. Okay, that's Rayleigh-Benard convection. We think we know a lot about that. Here's stratified convection. This is some work by Evan Anders, a graduate student at CU who's entering his 3rd year. These are 2D simulations of compressible stratified convection. So here's our photosphere. Here's the bottom. This spans 3 density scale heights. So the density varies by 20 across this. Sun is 14. Here's low Mach number. Here's high Mach number. Here's pretty diffusive. Here's pretty turbulent. And there are a number of things here. One, now the upflows and downflows look fairly different from each other. The upflows are sort of spreading trees. As the flow comes up, it expands in the density stratification, pushing the downflow out of the way. The downflow is, meanwhile, kind of a gathering tree, like Bob Stein has talked about for a number of years, where material collects and then falls down in kind of a coherent structure. If you're fairly laminar, you get these kind of big honey blobs that span the entire convection zone. If you're pretty turbulent, you get lots of little things, some of which whip around and around and around, before finally being diffusively absorbed in one spot or the other. They visually look different. Their flow properties end up being surprisingly similar. The high Mach number and the low Mach number is almost indistinguishable at this kind of level. They look the same.
Are the colors vorticity or temperature?
The colors here are the entropy, so effectively the temperature. Right? So cold things down, red things up.
And was this just set up with the heat source in the bottom?
This is set up with a sort of controlled, unstable stratification. So yeah, it's like there's a heat source at the bottom and a cold source at the top. So it's got fixed temperatures, actually.
It looks to me like the what you call it, the honeydew one?
Yeah.
It almost looks like the downflow is, like, if you had set up the downflow to start, then everything else would have just followed from that because of your boundary conditions.
Yeah, you see it kind of like pouring down and then splashing along the boundary and then some return flow up. Yeah.
But you are actually putting in heat at the bottom too.
Yeah, effectively. Yeah, and so these come about. And the reason that we were playing around with these in 2D is that, broadly speaking, these top plots are comparable to the parameter space for the state-of-the-art global scale simulations, and these are about 2 orders of magnitude further out in parameter space for turbulent transport. So there are certain things we can access here, both because we're in 2D and also because we're not in a sphere, and spheres are challenging to compute on at high resolution. Okay, in kind of detail for the high Mach number ones, and you zoom in on them, there are some things that are different. There actually are there are shocks, so the flows at the top are about Mach 1, and they're shocking, and you can see those shocks doing kind of what we expect in heating the fluid that comes through them. There's some other peculiarities, but when you kind of step back, it's extremely difficult to tell the difference between the high Mach number flows and the low Mach number flows, which was a great surprise to us. We thought there'd be substantial structural differences between the two. The major structural difference seems to be just do shocks appear as you reach high Mach number. You can see them. There are these discontinuities reaching pretty far down. As a numerical note, this is actually a spectral method. So spectral methods can actually stably capture shocks if you have enough resolution thrown at the problem, and if the shock is being mediated by physics. So here it's being viscously mediated. What did we find? We found something fairly surprising. So we recovered, didn't really come up with, but we recovered a Nusselt number for stratified compressible convection, which had been found in the late 70s and in the early 80s, and then seems to have kind of been lost for a while. And we measured this over a huge parameter space. And the high Mach number stuff is in purple, and it does one set of transport. Different branches of low Mach number are in yellow and green, and they're sort of the interesting thing to look at. Those are the models that are maybe representative of something like deep convection, and something that really surprised us is they actually have the exact same heat transport scaling as Rayleigh-Benard convection. So incompressible water in a column has so far the same kind of heat transport scaling as very turbulent stratified convection. As Brad and I were talking about at the very beginning, this is true for the heat transport. This is probably not at all true for the transport of other things that interest us, like angular momentum or field, which are more sensitive to those structure changes.
What were your thermal boundary conditions?
Here they're fixed temperature, top and bottom. so that this is a well-defined measurement in the same kind of way as Rayleigh Benard.
Fixed temperature or entropy?
Temperature, actual temperature, fixed temperature. So with fixed flux and so forth, you could do other different measurements that should show the same thing. They do in Rayleigh Benard at least. We haven't tried those yet. The high Mach number stuff does kind of its own thing. This break point here is actually where the shocks appear. So shocks make the flow less efficient at transporting heat, but until the shocks appear, the flow is more efficient at transporting heat. And it's actually, for true aficionados of this stuff, it's actually doing ultimate regime transport until the shocks appear. So it's doing Rayleigh number to the 1/2 transport until the shocks appear. So, and again, sort of just for an idea of comparison, here's where a lot of global scale simulations are done in sort of parameter space. Here's where the absolute state of the art of them are done in parameter space. And in an isolated experiment like this, we can get out to here. We don't so far really see anything fundamentally different other than the structure changes, but this makes these kind of interesting laboratories. What else do we see when we do this? So something that was kind of interesting to us is that some of these solutions, so this is 2 movies at 2 times in the exact same solution. This is sort of how a lot of these solutions look, but if you run them for long enough, a number of them will build up their own global scale shear, self-consistently. So this happens when the 2 big convective structures on the left manage to kind of cross over each other, and the downflow pushes on the upflow, and then they can tilt and they can amplify the shear and get this thing racing. And when the shear is going, the thing that is different in this right picture, other than the constant streaming flow, is that the big cells that span the entire domain are gone. So shear flows seem to be fairly efficient at killing the biggest scales of motion. They don't change the small scale spectrum at all. If you look at the power spectra of these 2, the small scale spectra looks the same, but the large scale spectra has dropped by about 2 orders of magnitude. So you can really flatten some of the giant cells of convection with a shear flow under some conditions. So that's a very interesting thing to look at some more. And the 2 states have some different properties of transport and other things. But the thing that's caught our eye here is a way of suppressing large-scale convection. This is ongoing work by Evan Anders. Okay. My second question I wanted to talk to you about is the tachocline. And how does the tachocline couple to the convection zone? So previously we were looking at convection zones only. So here's the entropy profile sketched as a function of height. Here's the top. Here's the bottom. And now we're going to take a convection zone and we're going to attack a radiative zone underneath it. And the experiment we're going to do is we're going to control how superadiabatic the convection zone is. And we're going to make a prediction that plumes that come down from the top and have a certain low amount of entropy are going to go down until they hit buoyancy equilibration in the radiative zone. And this prediction turns out to work quite well. So the plumes in sort of turbulent states are going to travel until they hit buoyancy equilibrium, and then they're going to stop. We're going to see some results of that, and then we're going to see the extrapolation of that to solar conditions under a whole bunch of approximations. Broadly speaking, this superadiabaticity, which we're controlling with the parameter epsilon, the Mach number of the convection goes as the square root of this thing. And so if we know something about the Mach number of convection, maybe we can estimate what this value should be in something like the sun, maybe. Right, so we have some idea of where we should be. So what do we see? So I'm going to show you 3 movies. So we're getting an experiment here. This is fairly high Mach number convection in the upper region. Down here, though, you can't really tell, is the stable region with internal gravity waves. This is a very soft layer. This is strongly driven flow, a fairly weak stable stratification in a real sense. And in this case, convection plays merry havoc with the stable region. There's a lot of convective overshoot and penetration. This is about a density scale height from the top of the radiative zone to its bottom right now. The convection is overshooting by more than that. It's getting stopped by a wall down here, as you see from these things plummeting down and then spinning on the lower boundary. There's not much wave action in the radiative zone. There's a lot of mixing. This is kind of our view of a very soft boundary layer. I think this has actually framed a lot of our view of what's going on in the real convection zone of the sun, because we think of very efficiently pumping magnetic field from the convection zone down deep into the tachocline, where it can be isolated from the convection above, where it can be slowly sheared out. So this is not at all stiff. This is kind of Mach number 1 in the convection zone. Here's something that's a little bit stiff. So the last one was a stiffness of 3. I'll tell you the solar value in a moment. This is a stiffness of 10. So now this is less unstable. This is the same. And you can see now the convection still does some stuff at the boundary, but doesn't get all the way down to the bottom. We're getting fairly large amplitude gravity waves in the interior, driven by this convection. And they're large in amplitude, but they're still linear. There's lots of mixing in the convection zone. There's not a lot of mixing down in the stable region. And we can measure how far these convective plumes are getting down into here. Here's one more step in this. Here's a stiffness of 100. So this is a fair bit better. So the radiative zone's been the same size in all these. So the convection zone's shrinking as we change this experiment. And now there's really very, very little that crosses this line where the convection zone radiative zone boundary is. The amount of overshoot in this, as we can measure, is a lot less than the density scale height. It's about 1/10 or so in this case. We have fairly small amplitude convective motions. We have waves that are about 10 times bigger than them in thermodynamic amplitude. Again, those waves are still linear. So these are the convectively driven internal gravity waves down in the stable region. Okay, what do we learn from this? So when we measure a bunch of these, we're going to plot it like this. So this is the amount of overshoot measured in density scale heights in the solutions. These are all, again, 3 density scale height stratified convection zones, as in the earlier work. The red line is a nonlinear measurement of where the convection is getting down to. So it's a measure of where things go linear, in a sense, and turn into waves. The blue and purple lines are a prediction of buoyancy equilibration. So where in the atmosphere we do hit buoyancy equilibration from the top. The two track each other in structure pretty well. The squares are sort of simple cases. The stars are more turbulent cases. I, of course, was showing you the movies from the stars because they're prettier. The dashed black line is a prediction from buoyancy equilibration from a simple analytic formula. Okay, these go out to a stiffness of about 10 to the 4, 10 to the 5. The solar tachocline is kind of in the 10 to the 4, 10 to the 8 range. The Y values here span from about 1 density scale height down to about 1/10 of a density scale height. All of this sounds good. Stellar models like to use 1/10 of a density scale height. 1/10 of the density scale height in the sun is comparable to the thickness of the tachocline. Everything's fine. Well, these models, these numerical models, have a large contribution of this thickness from the way that we actually construct the atmosphere, which is kind of a spurious thing, but something we can measure. So the way we smoothly go from the convection zone into the radiative zone by fiat sets a lot of this story. And if we try to actually come up with an arbitrarily thin matching between the convection zone and the stable region, because it's not being done by us, it's being done by nature, we can come out with a formula for what the amount of overshoot should be, so we can analytically predict it. That predicts our simulations well. And that formula goes something like this. Some things about the polytropic indices of the radiative zone and convection zone. This is 3 in the sun, more or less. This is 1.5 in the sun, because it's essentially adiabatic. The number of density scale heights shows up here in the numerator. The stiffness shows up in the denominator. The number of density scale heights is 14. The stiffness is 10 to the 4 to 10 to the 8. So if these sorts of models extrapolate it all towards the sun, this would say the tachocline in the sun is an extremely thin structure, maybe 1,000th of a density scale height rather than 1/10 of a density scale height. So that really says that the convective motions in the sun potentially might really not be getting very deep down into that tachocline. And a lot of the tachocline structure that we see is either the observation kernels being thick, or it's some other coupling across that, like the magnetic coupling or other things like that. And this shear layer seems more challenging to tap into for dynamo engine processes or other things like that. So that's the recent heresy from simplified simulations in the interior of the sun, and some of the questions we're grappling with. What sets the scaling and amplitude of the convective modes, and how thoroughly do they couple across a stable, unstable interface?
Ben, could you tell us what you would expect 3D to do compared to these two-dimensional ones?
Yeah. So that's a very interesting question. So from previous 3D work in the early 2000s, there was fairly little difference, broadly speaking. And there may be fairly little here. The thing that really becomes different between the two, I think, is some of the roles that pressure plays. So pressure here, as these modes come down and hit that and see the stagnation pressure, in 2D, that's a very strong constraint. And in 3D, there's more ways to allow the high pressure region to get around them and for these to potentially penetrate in deeper. Those will be very interesting experiments to do and haven't been done since Nick Brummel's work in the early 2000s and Steve Tobias's work, right? And I think the interesting thing now is that we're in some spots where we can really get to where the motions remain turbulent all the way down to the bottom, rather than becoming fairly diffusive, and as that early work had to be, right? So I think that's a very fascinating question to ask.
The other piece that ultimately comes into play with 3D is, of course, that this is a spherical shell. That should change this picture, because you have then basically a preferred direction.
Well, and even more important, I think, in the spherical shell setting is actually the rotation effects. So rotation effects can also cause these things to burrow in a fair bit deeper, because now you have a coherent structure that's swirling and that maintains that coherence as it goes down. And as it goes down, it actually gets more rotationally constrained because it's slowing down as it hits this tachocline. So it knows even more about the rotational constraint, which among other things tends to try and have things align. So there could be very strong coupling into some of the rotational modes. We don't actually know at this point. So that'd be fascinating to see. So, Craig?
Again, I'm just going way off on a tangent here.
Yeah.
Where does the local dynamo live on these diagrams? That is to say, people talk about a local dynamo and an omega dynamo. You've talked a lot about the omega effect down at Tachocline. Where do you place the alpha effect?
So the alpha effect would be like, well, okay, so the alpha effect for a global scale dynamo, at least in the global scale solutions, seems to be occurring throughout a lot of the convection zone, especially down in the lower parts, kind of the lower density scale height or so. But the sort of surface local dynamo, right, that's all up here and is within just like that much of the surface, right, if that exists and if that operates. Yeah. So we do see in the global scale stuff, a lot of the colloidal field generation is right kind of down here at this base region, but extended over maybe a density scale height or so, or half of the convection zone. So, Matthias.
Maybe just a follow-up regarding the local dynamo. I mean, at least what we found is kind of that, I think local dynamo is a kind of misleading term because it's kind of happening everywhere in the convection zone. And then if you assume it's only localized in the photosphere, you cannot explain the amount of quasar magnetism we have. You have to assume it happens everywhere throughout the convection zone. So it's kind of a non-local, local dynamo.
Or every neighborhood is good.
Right. Mark.
So what prevents this thing, the overshoot region, from burrowing down is your radiative profile, your radiative flux profile.
That's right.
So what do you use for that, and is the structure of the overshoot sensitive to that at all?
It probably is. So these sorts of solutions, these, in a sense, the structure of the radiative flux is what we actually prescribe, and that sets up all the rest of the atmosphere, and it cannot adjust in time. So you're seeing sort of adjustments around the boundary that we handed it. The really interesting experiment would be to try and get one of these internal interfaces consistently from like radiative conductivity that depends on temperature and density in the right way to have an unstable and stable region. And I don't know how to do that. I think Axel has some ideas on that. Other people may have some ideas on that, and I'm really interested in those. And those are experiments we actually, I think, know how to do now, where you could allow this to establish self-consistently and to evolve over time. So in a plug for Gabo's work, these are very hard problems because these have extremely long time scales, especially in a turbulent case like this. So you need to actually step away from a simple code like this. It's just starting with initial conditions and chugging along in time. And we probably need to do something clever, like you compute one of these for a while, you get the turbulent transport coefficients, you run some long 1D integration to get the structure right and equilibrated, you come back, you try a 2D run again or 3D run again to see if you've got the same kind of statistics, and you do some iteration of that, some coupled, the fancy pants name for these is parallel and time methods, or temporal multi-grid methods, but you need some more clever approach than just grinding away, because this thing, the thermal timescale of this layer at these kinds of parameters is probably 10 to the 4 to 10 to the 6 times longer than the time for one of these blobs to plummet down like this, and we can compute for about 10 to the 2 of those. So you just cannot brute force through, and that takes a day on 1,000 processors. And so, yes, you can multiply that up by about 10, but multiplying that up by 2 orders of magnitude right now requires an entire year of running one of these things. That becomes pretty intractable. So you need I think you need some more clever methods. Gabo is actually playing with some of those right now, at least in a side experiment. So
Right now?
right now, while he's sitting there. Matthias.
Yeah, there are also some seismic constraints on overshoot, or maybe better on, I should say, on the smoothness of the transition from the nearly adiabatic overshoot convection zone to the radiative interior.
Oh, okay.
And the surprising thing is that the transition is much smoother than you think it should be, and if you translate that smoothness into an overshoot distance, it's definitely more than 10% of a pressure scale height.
Okay.
The overshoot would have to be strongly subadiabatic, which is completely the opposite of what you expect from any kind of ballistic overshoot model.
Yeah, this is kind of what very
it looks more like
overshoot
that
looks
actually.
Or
I mean,
actually,
like
here, this one.
Yeah.
Right. This is overshoot into a weakly subadiabatic layer in a sense, right? Where
And that
it
is at
coasts for a
least
long
what
way.
those pseudo-seismic constraints kind of favor.
Can you send me some
I
references
can
for
send
that?
you some.
I would be fascinated to see those. Yeah. Michael, and then Axel, because Axel has.
So now, I mean, all these numerical experiments are, of course, every theoretician's dream to study the parameter space to really depths that 20 years ago we wouldn't have expected. Now, your big problem right now is that the observational constraints are useless because these guys cannot agree what they're measuring. What is the situation in observational constraints with other stars, with other realizations of dynamos?
So I think probably the strongest observational constraint from other stars is probably measurements of the differential rotation pattern at their surfaces and the amplitude of it. We have very little way to get a handle on the convective amplitudes in other stars. It's hard for the sun, it's essentially impossible for other stars. But we do have some constraints coming in, some existing and more coming in from the time domain surveys of amplitudes of the differential rotation at the surface, and that and its scaling with rotation and stellar luminosity could tell us a lot about whether models are anywhere in the right kind of parameter space. And the reason for that is that you get both the rotation lever and also the luminosity lever, or the convective amplitude lever, as it were, and you can really start to see, as you span that, you start to really see two different physical effects, the motions versus the rotational constraint. Right, and so that is a tricky set of observations. Kepler has done a fair bit with that. TESS is going to do a lot more with that, and some of the time domain spectroscopic mapping of stars, where they're doing Doppler imaging, doing high resolution spectra over repeated visits, sometimes with polarimetry to help disambiguate field orientations. Those are huge avenues for progress. We've been trying to encourage the observationalists to make those exact measurements, the amplitude of the differential rotation. The reason that's an interesting constraint for the global scale models is the differential rotation is kind of the 0th order thing that's built by the convection, and that's large scale that you can see. It's also the ingredient that's needed for the dynamos, at least of a kind of solar-like dynamo.
Yeah.
And so, knowing that observationally is already interesting, and it gives you a fairly big constraint, I think, on the global scale models and whether they're in the right regime.
So when do you expect from that kind of research some definite constraints?
I think
5 years, 10
within
years?
5 years. Yeah, I think within 5 years. Right now, a lot of the techniques are very challenging. So on the Zeeman Doppler imaging in particular, the best groups out of that are sort of the Pascal Petit group and the St. Andrews group on the stellar side. And they have some fundamental disagreements in their own measurements of the same star at different epochs. And this is because of a large covariance between the rotation rate of the star and the differential rotation. There's a fairly long valley in the chi-squared space. And so when you have some other constraints on those stars' rotations from like spot monitoring or things like that, then you start to break some of that. So it's both accumulating more data and also understanding the algorithms better. I think 5 years is very realistic for that.
It's a 5-year plan.
It's a 5-year plan, that's right. Plenty of time to get 10. Excellent.
If we say that giant cell convection is not observed, then Brad and Nick had an answer, namely to invoke Busse cells instead. Now the question is there any evidence that Busse cells might exist? Or would we, or can one actually exclude those also? Which would, I mean, we would not be able to exclude them theoretically, but this would of course mean that there must be a great deal of shielding in either of these two pictures, which is not solved. This is not a problem not solved.
Yeah. So Lisa and Dave Hathaway did some stuff on supergranules, thinking they saw big extended cells. I think. Right?
Horizontally though, not
Horizontally.
cells,
Okay.
no.
Not vertically.
Yeah.
And the other kind of interesting bit of observational evidence for aligned cells that I haven't seen follow-up on was Jason Lyle and Mark Rath's work back in the early 2000s, where they saw alignment in the supergranulation pattern over a huge range of latitudes. Like, maybe, right? Maybe there's some hints of that, but it always has felt like those observational results have also been fairly fragile. Like, none of them have just been a, like, bango, like, we see this structure, it's unambiguous, no one's arguing about it.
And furthermore, if the turbulence is, if it's turbulent enough, you don't actually expect to see big, long structures that span the entire sun.
Yeah.
The really turbulent, highly rotationally constrained convection, each little bit is moving around in little circles, but they don't have the extended structures.
Yeah.
They break up. The Busse cells break up when
Keep
it becomes
Jones
turbulent
did a
enough.
bunch of
So would you
Yes.
think there is a conflict observationally or not a conflict?
There's no observations that.
No conflict there.
Yeah.
The problem is that if we're right, they would be the size of supergranules.
Yeah.
And so how do you tell the difference?
I see. Yeah.
So I think one thing to go
Another
looking
subtlety,
for,
of course.
Yeah, that's right.
I think when we have a helioseismic mission that can see the solar pole, like some of the out of ecliptic missions that have been proposed, when you look down on the solar pole, if you can integrate longer than the supergranular lifetimes, you might be able to see these vortical structures of kind of the columnar structure coming up and hitting the surface there, right? At the equator, if they're big columns, we're seeing them at kind of their spreading centers. At the poles, we'd see them as swirling things. That has an entirely different velocity structure than spreading supergranular cells. You might be able to pick that out somewhere up there. I've kind of dreamed about this for a while. So if we could do something like that, that might give us, we might see a bit like Juno's seeing at the Jovian poles, where it's seeing all these big storms. We might see essentially these big swirling storms at the solar pole that were the print of these giant cells. I don't know. Theorist dreams. So.
I'm going to have to close the discussion there.
Yeah. I'll stay here and keep visiting. So.
Right. Let's thank Ben again.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you all. That was super fun.